December 20th, 1943. A German fighter pilot lines up his gun sights on a crippled American bomber limping across the sky. One burst of cannon fire, and the Knight's Cross is his, the highest honor Germany can give. But when France Stigler looks through the holes in the fuselage, he does not see an enemy. He sees something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. And in that moment, he makes a decision that could get him executed. Charlie Brown had been a bomber pilot for exactly one mission when everything went wrong over Bremen. 21 years old, fresh from training, assigned to the 379th Bomb Group in England, and sent straight into the fire. His B-17 was called Ye Olde Pub. The name was painted on the nose in cheerful letters that now seemed like a joke. They were supposed to bomb a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory. Get in, drop the payload, get out. Simple on paper, lethal in practice. The formation approached Bremen in tight boxes, dozens of bombers stacked together for mutual protection, every gunner scanning the sky, every pilot holding position. The flak started before they reached the target. Black bursts of shrapnel exploding at their altitude, shaking the planes, punching holes through aluminum skin. Brown kept the pub steady. The bombardier released 12 500-pound bombs on the factory below. Clean drop. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to make it home. That is when the German fighters arrived. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, fast and deadly, slicing through the formation like wolves into a herd. Brown's plane took hits immediately. Cannon shells tore through the wings. One engine started smoking, trailing fire. The co-pilot, a lieutenant everyone called Pinky, shut it down before it exploded. Another engine died, then another. The pub started falling behind the formation, slower and lower. A wounded animal separated from the pack. A German fighter made a head-on pass, cannons blazing. The nose of the pub exploded in a shower of plexiglass. The navigator and bombardier, trapped in the nose, were hit by shrapnel and freezing wind. Blood sprayed across the instruments. The tail gunner, a sergeant from Ohio, swung his guns to return fire, but a 20mm shell punched through the tail turret and killed him instantly. The plane shuddered. The controls went soft in Brown's hands, hydraulics failing, oxygen system damaged, electrical system shorting out. Brown lost consciousness. Hypoxia from the thin air at 27,000 feet. The plane entered a dive, spinning toward the earth with no pilot at the controls. When Brown woke up, they were at 4,000 feet, barely above the German countryside and still falling. He pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The pub leveled out just above the treetops, so low that farmers on the ground could see the faces of the crew through the holes in the fuselage. The intercom was dead. Brown sent Pinky back to check on the crew. What Pinky found was a nightmare. The tail gunner was dead. The ball turret gunner was wounded and unconscious, trapped in his turret with no way to get out. The waist gunners were hit, bleeding, barely able to stand. The radio operator was trying to stop the bleeding on a gunner who had taken shrapnel to the leg. Half the crew was incapacitated. The other half was in shock, and they were still 150 miles from England, flying a plane that should have already crashed. France Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt at an airfield near Bremen when he heard the bomber. Low and slow, engines coughing, limping across the sky like a dying bird. Stigler was 28 years old, a seasoned fighter pilot with 27 confirmed kills. 2 more bombers that morning alone. 1 more kill and he would earn the Knight's Cross, the medal that every German pilot dreamed of. The ultimate recognition of skill and courage, a badge that said you were one of the best. He did not wait for clearance from the tower. He climbed into his 109, started the engine, and took off in pursuit. The bomber was flying so low that it disappeared behind the trees, following the contours of the land to avoid the flak guns. Stigler caught up in seconds. He pulled alongside, lining up his gun sights on the left wing. This was it. The Knight's Cross, his place in history. All he had to do was press the trigger. But then he looked through the holes in the fuselage. He saw the wounded crew stumbling through the wreckage inside their own plane. He saw blood on the walls. He saw the tail gunner slumped in his turret, motionless. He saw a ball turret gunner unconscious and bleeding. He saw men trying to save each other with no medical supplies and no hope. And he saw the pilot, barely conscious, fighting to keep the plane in the air. Stigler had been taught the rules of engagement by his commanding officer, a man named Gustav Rödel, who had flown in the First War and knew what honor meant. Rödel had told him once, "You do not shoot a man in a parachute. You do not strafe a lifeboat. You do not kill a man who cannot fight back." This bomber, Stigler realized, was a flying lifeboat. The crew was defenseless. The tail guns were not moving. The plane was barely flying. It was not a military threat. It was a wreck full of dying men. He pulled back on the stick and moved into formation beside the bomber, close enough to see the pilot's face. Charlie Brown looked over and saw the German fighter 3 feet from his wingtip. He thought he was dead. He thought Stigler was there to finish the job at point-blank range, but Stigler was not aiming. He was gesturing, pointing down, signaling Brown to land. Brown shook his head. Landing in Germany meant becoming a prisoner of war. It meant sitting out the rest of the war in a camp. It meant uncertainty and fear and the possibility of never seeing home again. Brown had orders: get the plane back to England, save the crew. Do not surrender unless there was no other choice. And as long as the engines were still running, there was a choice. Stigler tried again. He pointed toward Sweden, neutral territory just across the Baltic Sea. Brown could land there. The crew would get medical treatment. They would be interned safe out of the war. But Brown refused. He kept flying west, toward the North Sea, toward England, toward home. Stigler made a decision that could have gotten him executed. He moved his fighter to the right side of the bomber, just off the nose, where the German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground could see him clearly. By flying in formation with the American bomber, he made it impossible for the flak guns to fire without risking hitting him. He was using his own plane as a shield, protecting the enemy, committing treason in broad daylight. They flew together across the German countryside, Brown struggling to keep the pub in the air, Stigler holding formation, watching the ground, waiting for someone to figure out what he was doing. Inside the bomber, the crew was confused. The tail gunner was dead, but the waist gunner could see the 109 through the holes in the fuselage. He swung his gun toward Stigler, ready to fire. Brown waved him off. "Do not shoot." Not yet. The German was not attacking. For some reason, he was helping. The coastal flak batteries loomed ahead, massive gun emplacements designed to shred anything that tried to cross the border. If the pub flew over those guns alone, it would be blown out of the sky in seconds. But with Stigler flying beside it, the gunners hesitated. They saw the 109. They saw the German markings. They held their fire. The bomber crossed the coast and headed out over the North Sea. Stigler stayed with them until they reached open water. There was no reason to stay, no tactical advantage, no strategic value. He was just making sure they had a chance. When they were far enough from the coast that the flak guns could not reach them, Stigler pulled up alongside Brown one last time. He looked across the gap between the planes. Brown looked back. 2 pilots, 2 enemies. One moment of understanding. Stigler saluted. Brown, exhausted and in shock, saluted back. Then Stigler peeled away, dove toward the water and disappeared. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. Brown still had 250 miles of open water to cross with 2 engines barely running and a crew that was bleeding out. The pub was flying on fumes and willpower. The North Sea in December was a death sentence if they went down. The water was cold enough to kill in minutes. There were no rescue planes, no ships close enough to help. If the engines quit, they were done. Pinky kept checking the fuel gauges, doing the math in his head, trying to figure out if they had enough to make it. The numbers did not look good. Brown kept the plane as level as possible, not wasting a single drop of fuel on unnecessary maneuvering. The crew in the back tried to keep each other warm. The nose was gone, the wind howling through the fuselage at 150 miles per hour. The temperature inside the plane was 30 degrees below zero. Frostbite and shock were killing the wounded just as surely as the shrapnel. The English coast appeared on the horizon like a miracle. Brown dropped lower, looking for an airfield, any airfield. He did not have enough fuel to be picky. The landing gear was damaged. The hydraulics were shot. He was going to have to land on the belly, hoping the plane did not cartwheel and explode. Then he saw it. RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group. Not his base, but close enough. Brown brought the pub in low and fast, no flaps, no brakes, just a controlled crash onto the runway. The plane hit hard, skidded, scraped, and finally stopped in a cloud of sparks and smoke. The crew stumbled out, some on their own, some carried by medics who ran to the wreck. The tail gunner was dead. The ball turret gunner was unconscious but alive. The rest were wounded, frostbitten, and in shock, but they were alive. Against every logical probability, they had made it home. At the debriefing, Brown told his officers about the German fighter that had escorted them to the coast. He described the salute. He described the mercy. The intelligence officer listened, took notes, and then told Brown never to repeat the story to anyone in the unit. Why? Because it was bad for morale. Because it was dangerous to let the crews think that the enemy could be human. Because in war, the enemy had to stay the enemy or the whole system fell apart. Brown followed orders. He did not talk about it. He flew more missions. He survived the war. But he never forgot the German pilot who had saved his life. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. Franz Stigler said nothing to his commanding officers about the bomber. He knew the rules. Letting an enemy escape was treason. Helping an enemy escape was execution. The Luftwaffe had already executed pilots for lesser offenses. Stigler had gambled his life on a moment of conscience, and he was not going to confess. He continued flying combat missions through late 1944. In October of that year, a 1-inch copper bullet from a B-17 punched through the windshield of his 109 and hit him in the forehead. The bullet did not penetrate his skull. It left a black hole of dried blood and a nasty dent in his head, but Stigler managed to fly back to base, conscious and alive. He kept the bullet as a souvenir, a reminder of how close death had come. The war ended. Stigler survived. He never earned the Knight's Cross. That one bomber over Bremen, the one he let go, would have been the kill that earned him the medal. Instead, he carried the secret for decades. He immigrated to Canada after the war, started a new life, and tried to forget. But the memory of the crippled bomber and the wounded crew stayed with him. Charlie Brown went home to the United States. He married. He started a career. He never spoke about the German fighter pilot. Not to his family, not to his friends, not to other veterans. It was a secret he carried alone, buried under years of normal life. But in the 1980s, something changed. Brown decided he needed to find the pilot who had saved his life. He did not know the name. He did not know if the man was still alive. He only knew the moment. Brown wrote letters to fighter pilot associations in Germany. He published ads in aviation magazines. He described the encounter in as much detail as he could remember. The date, the location, the type of plane, the salute, the escort. For years he heard nothing. Then in 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. It was from Franz Stigler. Stigler had seen one of Brown's letters in a newsletter. The details matched perfectly. The date, the location, the crippled B-17, the escort to the coast. Stigler knew immediately that this was the bomber. He wrote back. They arranged to meet. In 1990, 47 years after the war, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler met face to face in the United States. Brown brought his wife. Stigler brought his wife. They sat together and talked for hours. They compared memories. They filled in the gaps. Brown described what it was like inside the bomber, the terror, the blood, the disbelief when the German fighter did not shoot. Stigler described what he saw through the holes in the fuselage, the decision he made, the risk he took. They both cried. They became close friends. They called each other regularly. They visited each other. They appeared together at veteran events and air shows, telling the story they had kept silent for nearly half a century. The press called it a miracle of mercy in the middle of war. Historians called it one of the most remarkable acts of chivalry in the entire conflict. But for Brown and Stigler, it was simpler than that. It was two men who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen, in one moment, to be better. The friendship lasted 18 years. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died 8 months later on November 24, 2008, at the age of 87. They were buried thousands of miles apart, but their families stayed in touch. The story they shared outlived them both. Let us put this story in context. On December 20, 1943, the United States 8th Air Force launched 437 heavy bombers against targets across Germany. Of those, 27 were shot down. Another 159 were damaged, some beyond repair. The casualty rate for bomber crews in Europe was staggering. 50% of airmen did not survive their 25-mission tour. 50%, 1 in 2. The odds were worse than Russian roulette. German fighter pilots faced similar odds. The Luftwaffe lost more than 30,000 pilots during the war. By late 1943, the life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot was measured in weeks, not years. Franz Stigler had already beaten the odds by surviving 2 years of combat. One more kill would have guaranteed his Knight's Cross and a transfer to a safer assignment. Instead, he let the bomber go. The distance from Bremen to the English coast is roughly 250 miles. Brown flew that distance on 2 failing engines, with half his crew incapacitated, at an altitude barely above the waves. The fuel burn alone should have been impossible. The fact that the plane did not break apart in midair was a mechanical miracle. The fact that Stigler escorted them through German airspace without being shot down himself was a tactical miracle. And the fact that both men survived the war and found each other 47 years later was a human miracle. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown does not fit neatly into the narrative of World War II. It is not about heroism in the traditional sense. It is not about victory or defeat. It is about a moment when the machinery of war broke down and two men saw each other as human beings instead of targets. Stigler did not have to spare the bomber. He had every tactical, strategic, and personal reason to shoot it down. But he looked through the holes in the fuselage and saw wounded men who could not fight back, and that was enough. Brown did not have to search for Stigler after the war. He could have let the memory fade. He could have kept the secret. But he needed to know the name of the man who had saved his life. He needed to say thank you. And when they finally met, they discovered that the moment had shaped both of them in ways they had never fully understood. The story raises uncomfortable questions. If one German pilot could show mercy in the middle of a brutal war, why could so few others? If one act of humanity could survive decades of silence and secrecy, what other acts were buried and forgotten? The war was full of cruelty, but it was also full of moments like this. Moments that did not fit the propaganda. Moments that were too complicated to explain. Moments that proved that even in the worst circumstances, people could choose to be better. Franz Stigler risked execution to save an enemy. Charlie Brown risked his mission to trust a German fighter pilot. Both men carried the weight of that decision for the rest of their lives. And when they finally shared the burden, they discovered that it was not a burden at all. It was a gift, a reminder that war does not erase humanity. It only tests it.